Houthi deadly mines continue to sweep lives of innocent civilians in Yemen, while the international community remains oddly silent. Amid government disapproval, the United Nations Imminent Committee issues their report indicating that the conflict in Yemen is complicated. Joint forces take up fierce fighting with the Houthi rebels in different fronts in Hodeidah and inflict heavy losses among them. Welcome to Yemen Today TV. This is the English news with me, Shaza Abdelbei. In a repeated Houthi crime against Yemeni civilians, a mine explosion injured 19 civilians. Most of them are women and children. The following report has more details on this issue.
While these victims were concluding their participation in a wedding party in their area and on their way back to their homes in a car that took them from Al-Qattaba area north of Al-Khoukha to their hometown in Al-Hayma town in Hodeidah, the disaster struck them with painful details that the victims hardly remember due to the horror of the accident that covered the place with blood and filled it with pieces. A new Houthi crime that left 19 civilians injured, most of them women and children, in a crime that is added to the Houthi record of crimes as a result of the explosion of a landmine from its remnants in the car, which resulted in the fall of many children and women, among whom were seriously injured. Field sources said that all the victims were taken to Al-Khoukha Field Hospital accompanied by emergency crews from the joint forces, where they were given first aid before they were transferred to Al-Makha Hospital to continue their treatment there and subject critical cases to extreme medical care. This crime is similar in its details to the crime of the village of Al-Hada in Al-Durahimi that took place in late July, which resulted in the death of 3 people and the injury of 11 others who were on board a private car on their way to a wedding party in the same district. This heinous crime comes within the framework of the militia's escalation of its criminal practices and acts against civilians in Hodeidah, as hundreds of families have been displaced during the past days from the villages of Al-Tuhaita as a result of the deliberate artillery shelling on residential neighborhoods, which they transfer daily to military areas.
Houthi deadly mines continue to sweep lives of innocent civilians nationwide, despite the giant efforts done by local, regional, and international organizations to demine these minefields. Lots of them remain hidden and unmapped. This report sheds light on this issue. The conflict in Yemen has been described as the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Since the Houthi rebels has taken over Yemen's capital Sana'a in 2014, there has been a civil war affecting the most vulnerable groups. One of the most dangerous factors impacting not only those involved in the civil war, but civilians is the fact that Yemen is covered in landmines and explosives. Since January 2018, over 140 civilians, including 19 children, have lost their lives to landmines in Hodeidah and Taiz governorates alone. Experts believe the death tolls of landmines fall somewhere above 9,000. Furthermore, since the impact of landmines is very difficult to track, the numbers are expected to be much higher than documented. Osama Al-Gusaybi, the program manager of the Saudi-funded Massam demining project, commented that it's not being used as a defensive or offensive mechanism. It's being used to terrorize the local population across Yemen. The mines impact the outreach of the aid and make it impossible for families to return to their homes. Priyanka Mothaparty, acting emergencies director researcher at Human Rights Watch, stated that Houthi-laid landmines have not only killed numerous of civilians, but they have prevented vulnerable Yemenis from harvesting crops and drawing clean water desperately needed for survival. The landmines are usually placed in open fields, roads, farmlands, wells, and even abandoned schools. In addition, they are hidden in tree trunks and fake rocks to make them more difficult to detect. There have also been reports of the militia rebels converting these anti-tank mines into anti-personnel mines. Landmines that would usually require the pressure of 220 pounds to explode have been alerted to only require 22 pounds. This means even the weight of a small child passing over the landmine would detonate. Yemen is impacted severely by landmines placed during the previous conflicts. This landmine problem is becoming worse due to the Houthi rebels placing their mines randomly and unmapped. Masam project cleared around 1,200 landmines during the past week of September. Up to 3 million square meters have been cleared and around 66,000 undetained landmines have been removed. But despite their efforts, the Yemeni government stated that it would take multiple decades to remove all mines from Yemen. You cannot rebuild Yemen without addressing the mine issue. Landmines will impact Yemen's future for decades to come. City of Mecca witnessed a massive demonstrations to denounce targeting of the Mecca port with Houthi missiles and drones. Meanwhile, international community did not condemn the attack that targeted the strategic port.
Despite being a heinous crime perpetrated against a civilian institution, there is a total state of international silence. Mecca port attack launched by Houthi rebels days ago is indeed a crime against Yemeni people, stability and future.
People of Mecca, backed by all Yemenis, are standing today united against the terrorist atrocities that targeted historical and commercial port of Mecca, which is one of the most remarked in the city. It is the oldest outlet for Yemen on the world and to the world. The Houthi terrorist attacks of Mecca port is directed to every house, families and single person in Mecca and everyone in Yemen as a whole. It assaults the present and the future of Yemenis. We, people of Mecca, call upon the Yemeni people to stand united against the war crimes that the Irani-backed militia, and they should end their arrogance. We call upon the whole world, starting with the United Nations, to assume their responsibilities and to act swiftly against these crimes that violate international laws and all conventions and norms.
The people in Mecca took to the streets to denounce the crime against their port. They said, the Houthi attack on the port is an attack on Yemen as a whole. They called on the international community to act, or even voice denouncement. Despite this popular condemnation, the international community presented in the United Nations didn't utter even a single word to denounce the Mecca attack. The World Power, as well as the Sweden sponsors of peace, didn't comment on the Houthi crime that targeted a civilian port which delivers humanitarian aid to millions in Yemen. The odd silence raises more questions over the world political circles and the hidden agendas of world powers concerning the Houthi rebels and their staunch ally, Iran. Mecca attacks are interpreted by many experts as new evidence that the rebels have no intention for peace. The attack comes hours after the new United Nations envoy presented his briefing that described the conditions of the country to the Security Council. The Yemeni resistance considers the attack as a message sent by Houthis to declare the refusal to efforts made for ending the war in Yemen and that they will continue their terrorist attacks, excusing no one. The Yemeni government, for its part, affirmed that Mecca attack would have never been happened if Houthi militia was punished for the repeated attacks against Yemeni people in different parts of the country.
The United Nations expert group on Yemen announced that the conflict in the country remained complex. The team's report recorded the violations and abuses committed in Yemen between July 2020 and June 2021, entitled A Forgotten Nation, a call for humanity to end Yemen's suffering. In the context, Yemen's ambassador in Geneva, Ali Mujawir, said that his country's government refuses to accept the team of experts appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva. According to Mujawir, the report issued by the team is rejected, as the team relied on misleading information, and the government adheres to the report of the Independent National Commission, charged with investigated allegations of human rights. In Hodeidah, clashes renewed in Hais between the joint forces and the Houthi rebels. The military media of the joint forces reported that the militia deployed reinforcements and tried to rearrange their defenses. Units of the joint forces clashed with militia members with various medium and heavy weapons, forcing them to flee as well as killing and wounding a number of their members. To Ma'rib, where the government forces backed by the resistance carried out ambitious targeting members of the Houthi militia in Al-Qassara and Sirwah, inflicted heavy losses among the rebels. Also, according to the military sources, coalition jets destroyed reinforcements of the militia. The raids resulted in the killing and wounding of dozens of the Houthi elements, including field leaders, and the destruction of their military equipment. Coming next. In Abyei, internally displaced people suffer from heavy rains.
ثالث على منطقة الروضة استهدف الأطفال الأبرياء اللي يلعبوا في الشارع. بيدعي للسلام يقولوا للسلام يقتل أطفالنا يقتل أطفالنا الأبرياء.
أنا قلت استجعت ولا قلنا يقع واحد صاروخ ثاني طلعت البيت حقنا عشان ألعب أنا وأصحابي والصاروخ انطرح.
Welcome back. Internally displaced hardship continues as flood storms displace camps in Abyei. The following report sheds light on the suffering of families in camps.
Families of Hodeidah flee fearing of death due to Houthi militia violations. This did not make much difference for displaced families here in Erudani camp in Abyei. Suffering became their way of living, especially with the heavy rains that the city has been witnessing for days.
The torrential rains came and destroyed our homes. Our beds were damaged, our food was submerged in water, and the bathrooms were flooded with water.
Floods hit their straw tents and made their lives more difficult. It destroyed their homes, ruined their beds and food.
Rain hits and destroys our houses that are made of straws. We suffer from torrential rains that ruin our food products that we cannot store. We are asking for aid as we need food, shelter, and tents.
Tragic conditions, starvation, displacement, and lack of shelter, which protects those poor from rain. This increased their hardship, especially children who are exposed to infections and epidemics.
Seasonal rains damaged displaced camps in Abyei. 8 sites were damaged, where around 651 internally displaced families were affected. As you can see in Hodeidah camp, the camp needs rehabilitation, where more than 2,326 families live in tents. They need homes that protect them from rain, flood, and the heat of the sun in the summer. We call on international organizations to make arrangements and provide shelter for the displaced from the war.
Farmers are also affected. Heavy rains and strong winds destroyed their farms and crops.
For the first time, strong winds and storms hit our farms. As you can see, banana and papaya trees are destroyed. We are suffering. We call on authorities to come and see our losses and compensate us.
Damages and risks increases despite constant appeals that goes unanswered by local authorities and humanitarian organizations operating in Yemen.
To Aden, to the south of Yemen, where a wave of angry rallies erupted in the city over the constant power cuts. Sources confirmed that the fire was set on tires to cut off the main street in Crater City in protest against the deterioration of living conditions and basic services, especially electricity. They called on the concerned authorities to provide services, stop the continuous collapse of the national currency, and pay the salaries of civil and military employees. Angry protests continued in Hadramaut, east of Yemen, as basic services continued to worsen in the city. Local residents said that the area of the protests expanded in Hadramaut as protesters blocked several streets and shops were closed in the city of Shahra. The wave of protests entered its third day in a row and included a number of districts in Hadramaut after they were confined to the city of Mukla. The economic situation in Yemen is witnessing its worst days in nearly 7 years since the start of war. The continuing collapse of the currency, inflation, and the absence of basic services put more pressure on people. More on this story is within this report.
The economic situation in Yemen is heading downward. The last episode of this deterioration is a new fall of the Yemeni rial against the United States dollar. The rial hovered around 1,086 against the dollar to register a record low. The fall obliged regulators to stop transactions for foreign exchange until further note. What is happening to the Yemeni local currency goes back to the situation in the whole country. The main factors are the ongoing war, the disruption of services, the need for humanitarian aids, and the absence of governance and responsibility. Monetary institutions in Yemen are divided between the government in Aden and the Houthi de facto control. There is price differentiation in local currency. Adding to that, Houthi restriction on the new issued currency that was circulated by the government did a lot of harm to the economy. The more troubling is the manipulation played by the private foreign exchange companies and the manipulations in the rate of dollar in the black market. The United Nations warned many times that the Yemeni economy is facing a troubling days ahead, especially in the government-controlled areas. The organization said that the diving rial would have catastrophic consequences on the economy and the commercial activity in the country. As a result, the life of Yemenis will be greatly affected, knowing that there are millions on the brink of poverty, hunger, and death. There are also many who struggle hard to cope, and those state servants who have not been paid for years. The humanitarian situation will worsen because of the economic situation that is subject to Houthi tapping and sapping of international aid that comes to the country through the Hodeidah port. For all of that, people went out to the streets. They are fed up with deteriorating life conditions. They went out to vent their anger against the government negligence in providing them with basic services. Protests flared in Hadramaut, specifically in Al-Mukalla city. The angry protesters set fire in tires and closed main roads in the city. Their first demand is to return back electric power in addition to other basic services. In the governorate of Abiyan and other parts of Yemen, there were protests too. The same demands were voiced and the same accusation to the same people were expressed. Looking into that, the government must act swiftly to return back life into its normality, and the international community should press harder on Houthis to end their unjust war.
The National Committee Against Coronavirus announced 38 new cases of COVID-19 in 7 governorates. Committee officials said on Twitter that 10 cases were recorded in Hadramaut, 9 in Ma'rib, 5 in Aden, 6 in Al-Bayda, 3 in Taiz, 3 in Shabwa, and 2 in Al-Mahra. Also 20 deaths were recorded plus 22 recovered cases. Here's a reminder of the main headlines. Houthi deadly mines continue to sweep lives of innocent civilians in Yemen, while the international community remains oddly silent. Amid government disapproval, the United Nations Imminent Committee issues. The report indicated that the conflict in Yemen is complicated. Joint forces take up fierce fighting with the Houthi rebels in different fronts in Hodeidah and inflict heavy losses among them. This is the end of the news. Thank you for watching.